Look at the top of the world, where there should be nothing but shifting ice and the silent, frozen expanse of the Arctic. There is now a pulsing grid of artificial light, massive industrial complexes, deep water ports, and the orange glow of rare earth refineries carve through the permafrost. This isn't a natural evolution of the frontier. This is the scar of a broken world order. In 2019, a proposal to buy a country was laughed off as a joke. A billionaire president's eccentric whim, dismissed by diplomats and mocked by the media. But in this timeline, the joke didn't die in a news cycle. The joke became an obsession. The obsession became a doctrine, and the doctrine became the largest, most audacious land grab of the 21st century. The transition was swift and brutal. What began as a diplomatic spat over a real estate deal spiraled into a systemic dismantling of sovereignty. It was the moment the rules-based order was replaced by raw, unchecked ambition. We are looking at a world where the North Pole is no longer a sanctuary of science, but the most heavily militarized zone on the planet. This is the story of the Arctic crisis, a timeline where the hunt for resources and strategic dominance turned the frozen North into a scorched earth battlefield. In our world, it was an absurdity. In this world, it was the end of peace as we knew it. To understand how the ice began to burn, we have to look back to August 2019. In our reality, the American interest in Greenland was a 3-day news cycle, a bizarre headline about a real estate mogul wanting to buy the world's largest island. But for the Pentagon, Greenland was never a joke. It is the anchor of the GIUK gap, the strategic choke point between Greenland, Iceland, and the United Kingdom that prevents the Russian Northern Fleet from spilling into the open Atlantic. It is home to Thule Air Base, the vital early warning shield against a polar nuclear strike. When Danish Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen called the proposal absurd, the world laughed. In our timeline, the tension simmered down after a few canceled meetings and a series of disgruntled tweets. But here, in this darker reality, the word absurd didn't just sting, it ignited a total transformation in American foreign policy. The White House didn't see a sovereign ally exercising its rights. They saw a gatekeeper obstructing the manifest destiny of the 21st century. Within weeks, a classified strategic review landed on the desks of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Its conclusion was chilling. Denmark was no longer viewed as a reliable custodian of the Arctic. They were officially labeled an uncooperative security partner. The diplomatic grace period was over. The United States had decided that if the front door to the Arctic wouldn't be sold, it was time to take it off its hinges. The era of polite requests had ended. The era of coercion had begun. The shift from rhetoric to reality happened overnight. Washington unveiled a new doctrine, targeted reciprocity. It sounded like a dry trade policy, but in Copenhagen, it felt like a declaration of war. Within 48 hours, massive tariffs were slapped onto Danish pharmaceuticals, wind turbines, and agricultural exports. The American market, the lifeblood of the Danish economy, began to vanish. But the economic squeeze didn't stop at trade. The U.S. abruptly withdrew all defense subsidies for Danish Arctic patrols, leaving the Royal Danish Navy's aging fleet to rust in the freezing harbors of the North Atlantic. The pressure then moved to Brussels. Behind closed doors at NATO headquarters, American envoys delivered a brutal ultimatum to European allies. You are either with the Arctic Security Initiative, or you are siding with a stubborn kingdom that is jeopardizing the defense of the West. One by one, fearful of their own trade relations with the U.S., European capitals went silent. Copenhagen looked to its neighbors for a lifeline, only to find the doors barred. This wasn't a negotiation anymore. Prime Minister Frederickson realized with a sinking heart that the United States wasn't looking for a deal. They were laying siege to her country's future, strangling the Danish economy until the cost of holding on to Greenland became more expensive than the island itself. The message was clear. In the New World Order, sovereignty was a luxury that Denmark could no longer afford. But economic strangulation was only the first phase. To take a country, you don't just need power, you need a story. In this timeline, that story arrived in the form of a leaked intelligence dossier that saturated the 24-hour news cycle within hours of its release. The China card was played with surgical precision. Reports began to surface of Chinese state-owned enterprises funneling millions into Greenlandic independence movements, allegedly bribing local officials to secure deep-water ports for the People's Liberation Army Navy. Whether the intelligence was true or manufactured didn't matter. The narrative had shifted irrevocably. Greenland was no longer being framed as a rejected real estate deal. It was now a vulnerable frontier, at risk of falling behind a new bamboo curtain. American media outlets began broadcasting 24/7 specials on the Arctic encroachment, painting Denmark as a well-meaning but hopelessly naive landlord who had allowed a wolf into the house. The rhetoric invoked a 21st century version of the Monroe Doctrine, the Polar Doctrine. Just as the United States had once declared the Western Hemisphere off-limits to European empires, Washington now declared the North Pole off-limits to Eastern influence. This provided the moral armor for the next stage of the escalation. The U.S. wasn't invading an ally. They were protecting a neighbor from a predatory superpower. The justification was locked in, and the American public was primed for action. All Washington needed now was a spark on the ground in Greenland itself to light the fuse, nuke Greenland. The wind howls through the streets of the capital, but it's no longer just the cold that's biting. The American economic squeeze on Denmark has trickled down, and for the people of Greenland, the results are catastrophic. Supply lines are choked. Prices for basic goods have tripled. In this timeline, the nuke crisis begins not with a shot, but with an empty grocery store shelf. Protests erupt outside the Inatsisartut, the Greenlandic parliament. The anger is palpable, but it isn't directed solely at Washington. Many Greenlanders, feeling abandoned by a Copenhagen that can no longer provide, begin to ask a dangerous question. Why should they suffer for a kingdom that can no longer protect its own interests? This is the moment the White House has been waiting for. In a move that sends shockwaves through the diplomatic world, the U.S. State Department announces a direct humanitarian assistance package. Within 48 hours, American cargo ships, not Danish ones, are docking in Nuuk, unloading crates of food, medical supplies, and fuel. They bypass Danish customs authorities entirely, treating Greenland as a sovereign entity in all but name. It is a blatant violation of international law. But to the hungry families on the docks, the American flag looks like a lifeline. With the aid comes the wedge. Washington unveils a formal proposal titled The Path to Prosperity. It is a direct compact offered to the Greenlandic people, billions of dollars in infrastructure investment, a guaranteed sovereign wealth fund, and total local autonomy. The unspoken condition is clear. Greenland must enter into a permanent security partnership with the United States, effectively seceding from the Danish realm. Inside the halls of the Greenlandic Parliament, the atmosphere is toxic. The chamber is violently split. Traditionalists argue that loyalty to the Danish crown is the only thing standing between them and becoming a corporate colony of the U.S. military-industrial complex. But the pro-independence factions, bolstered by American promises and the sight of U.S. flags on aid boxes, see a golden ticket to a future without poverty. The unity of the Arctic is dead. As the debate in Nuuk descends into shouting matches and walkouts, the internal political fabric of Greenland begins to tear. The flashpoint has been reached. Washington has successfully turned a territory against its own sovereign, creating the perfect vacuum of authority needed for the final physical move. The political siege is over. The era of the ultimatum is about to begin. The velvet glove of humanitarian aid has been discarded, revealing the iron fist beneath. In Washington, the rhetoric shifts from assistance to unavoidable necessity. On a Tuesday morning that will live in infamy for European diplomacy, the White House issues a formal ultimatum. The demand is unprecedented. The United States requires joint administrative control over the entirety of Greenland's coastline. The justification? To ensure maritime safety and regional stability in an increasingly volatile Arctic. In plain English, Washington is demanding the keys to Denmark's house. In Copenhagen, the response is one of cold defiance. The Danish Prime Minister, standing before a frantic press corps, delivers a stinging rebuke. She cites the UN Charter, the sanctity of borders, and the very foundations of international law. Sovereignty, she declares, is not a commodity to be traded for convenience. Denmark officially refuses the ultimatum, calling on its European allies to condemn this act of imperial overreach by their supposed protector. But the American response is swift and surgical. Within hours of the Danish refusal, the breaking point is reached. The U.S. National Security Agency and the Pentagon abruptly suspend all intelligence sharing with Denmark. For decades, the Danish military has relied on American satellite data and acoustic sensors to monitor the treacherous waters of the North Atlantic. Now, the screens in Copenhagen go dark. The Danish Navy is effectively blinded, unable to track the movements of foreign vessels or even their own allies. The conflict has officially moved beyond the sphere of economics and politics. The silent digital war has begun, and the physical shadow of the U.S. military is already moving toward the horizon. The digital blackout in Copenhagen was merely the curtain raiser for the physical stage of the crisis. While Danish analysts stared at empty radar screens, the horizon of the Davis Strait began to fill with the silhouettes of the most powerful navy on Earth. Under the banner of Operation Northern Shield, the Pentagon declared a massive, unannounced SNAP exercise to ensure the security of Arctic shipping lanes. To the international community, it was a thin veil for a blockade. To the Danes, It was a declaration of intent. In the gray, choppy waters off the coast of Nuuk, the tension finally broke. The HDMS Laugekok, a Danish Arctic patrol vessel, was conducting what should have been a routine sovereignty mission near a disputed fishing zone. Suddenly, its radar, operating on limited backup systems, pinged a massive contact. Emerging from the freezing fog was the USS Jason Dunham, an Arleigh Burke-class destroyer, looming like a steel mountain over the smaller Danish ship. The radio crackled with a chillingly polite American voice. "Danish vessel, you are entering a restricted exercise zone. For your own safety, alter course immediately to 270. The Danish commander replied, his voice steady but laced with disbelief. "This is sovereign Danish territory. You are the ones in violation of international maritime law. We are maintaining our course." The response was not verbal. The massive American destroyer accelerated, its bow wave crashing against the hull of the Laugekok as it performed a high-speed intercept maneuver. It was a game of maritime chicken, played with thousands of tons of hardware. At the last possible second, facing the literal weight of American steel and the realization that his ship would be crushed in a collision, the Danish captain was forced to veer away. His crew watched in stunned, humiliated silence as the American flag receded back into the mist, unchallenged. No shots were fired, no blood was spilled, but the dangerous precedent had been set. The world watched in horror as the unthinkable became reality. The United States was willing to use its military might to physically intimidate and displace a core NATO ally. The alliance, forged in the fires of the Cold War to protect Western sovereignty, was now the very tool being used to dismantle it. The message to every small nation on Earth was loud and clear. Your borders are only as secure as Washington's patience. The velvet glove was gone, and the iron fist was now firmly at Denmark's throat. The strategic review had become a tactical reality. The maritime confrontation off Nuuk was the spark, but the fire was about to consume the land itself. Within hours of the incident at sea, the Pentagon released a briefing alleging credible intelligence of an imminent sabotage plot against Thule Air Base by foreign-backed actors. Under the guise of an emergency security annexation, the rules of engagement shifted instantly. At Thule, U.S. Marines didn't just man the gates, they moved past them. Humvees and light armored vehicles rolled out into the frozen tundra, expanding their perimeter for missiles to seize critical civilian infrastructure, including local power stations and communication hubs. The 1951 Defense Agreement, which had strictly limited the American footprint for decades, was effectively torn up in real time. But the true hammer blow fell further south. Kangerlussuaq Airport, the primary civilian gateway to Greenland, saw a fleet of C-17 Globemasters touch down not with humanitarian aid, but with battalions of the 10th Mountain Division. Within 60 minutes, the gateway to the Arctic was under U.S. military control. The official statement from Washington was clinical. The occupation was a temporary measure to ensure logistical stability and prevent the collapse of essential services amidst the growing regional tension. To the Danish administrators on the ground, however, it felt like a cold, calculated invasion. For the first time since World War II, an Allied power had physically occupied the territory of another Western democracy without an invitation or a treaty. The global reaction was one of pure, unadulterated shock. An emergency session of the United Nations Security Council was convened in New York, the air in the chamber thick with a tension not felt since the height of the Cold War. The Danish ambassador, his voice trembling with a mix of fury and desperation, called for an immediate withdrawal of all U.S. forces and a full restoration of Danish sovereignty. He spoke of the death of trust and the betrayal of a century-old friendship. The room held its breath as the resolution to condemn the annexation was put to a vote. But the result was a foregone conclusion. Raising a steady hand, the U.S. ambassador exercised the ultimate weapon of the post-war order, the veto. With that single gesture, the United Nations was rendered powerless. Its charter reduced to scrap paper in the face of superpower interest. The transition was complete. This was no longer a diplomatic dispute, a trade war, or a war of words. It was a physical occupation, a boots-on-the-ground reality that the rest of the world was forced to watch in helpless silence. The Arctic had been claimed, and the rules-based order was bleeding out on the ice. As American flags were raised over Greenlandic airstrips, the world realized that the old alliances weren't just bending, they were breaking. As the American veto echoed through the halls of the UN, the shockwaves traveled across the Atlantic, slamming into the heart of Europe. The European Union, long the bastion of soft power and international law, found itself paralyzed by a crisis it was never designed to handle. In Brussels, the atmosphere was one of frantic, hushed panic. In emergency summits, France and several Nordic nations demanded immediate, biting sanctions against Washington, calling the occupation a naked act of 21st century imperialism. But the consensus shattered instantly. To the east, nations bordering Russia, Poland, and the Baltic states watched in terrifying silence. For them, the choice was impossible. Defend a Danish territory thousands of miles away, or risk alienating the only superpower capable of deterring Moscow from their own doorsteps. The EU's common foreign and security policy didn't just fail, it evaporated, leaving a continent divided and defenseless. Then came the moment that truly shattered the old world. In a desperate, final attempt to save its sovereignty, Denmark did the unthinkable. For the first time in the history of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, a founding member invoked Article 5, the sacred "an attack on one is an attack on all" clause, naming the United States as the aggressor. Copenhagen formally declared that its territory had been invaded and called upon its allies for military assistance. It was a legal and existential paradox that froze the gears of the alliance. At NATO headquarters in Brussels, the silence was deafening. The request was not formally rejected, it was simply ignored. The Secretary General's office issued a vague, hollow statement about de-escalation and internal dialogue, effectively burying the Danish plea under layers of bureaucratic stalling. The message was clear to every world leader. The post-World War II security architecture, the very foundation of global stability for 70 years, was dead. NATO was no longer a shield for the sovereign. It was a tool for the powerful. and the rules only applied when the superpower allowed them to. The rules-based order had been replaced by a raw, unapologetic realism where might dictated right. As the Danish flag was lowered in symbolic mourning across European capitals, the geopolitical map was being redrawn not by treaties, but by the cold, hard weight of American steel. The fracture was complete, and in the vacuum left by the collapse of Western unity, the fate of Greenland was no longer a matter of law, but a matter of submission. In the shadow of American destroyers and the constant hum of military transport planes, the political reality of Greenland underwent a surgical transformation. On a frozen morning in Nuuk, a group of Greenlandic leaders, exhausted by weeks of economic strangulation and dazzled by the promise of a multi-billion-dollar prosperity fund, sat across from U.S. diplomats to sign their future away. The result was the Nuuk Accords, a document that would forever alter the map of the North. Under its terms, Greenland officially severed its nearly 3-century-long union with the Danish crown. In its place, a new entity was born, the Commonwealth of Greenland, a U.S. associated state. On paper, it boasted local autonomy. In reality, it was a status modeled after Puerto Rico, but with a predatory focus on the earth beneath the ice. Washington gained exclusive rights to Greenland's defense, foreign policy, and most crucially, its vast untapped mineral wealth. For the Danish officials remaining in Nuuk and Kangerlussuaq, the signing of the Accords was a death knell. A total U.S. naval blockade had already cut off their supply lines from Copenhagen, leaving them with no choice but a humiliating retreat. On the docks of Nuuk Harbor, the scene was one of quiet, bitter defeat. Danish flags, some having flown over the island since the 18th century, were folded with trembling hands as administrators, scientists, and police officers boarded chartered flights back to a Europe that had failed to protect them. There were no grand ceremonies, no parting handshakes between allies. As the last Danish transport cleared the runway, the Arctic crisis transitioned from a military standoff into a formal annexation. Danish sovereignty over the world's largest island was over, replaced by an American protectorate that viewed the land not as a community to be governed, but as a strategic asset to be stripped. The era of the rules-based order hadn't just ended in a boardroom, it had ended on a windswept tarmac in the high Arctic, leaving the world to watch as the first great land grab of the new century was codified into law. Within months, the silence of the Arctic, a silence that had endured for millennia, was replaced by the rhythmic, mechanical thud of industrialization. The ink on the Nuuk Accords was barely dry before the heavy drills began to bite into the earth. The melting permafrost, once viewed as a global climate catastrophe, was now treated by Washington as a logistical convenience. Massive open-pit mines began to scar the landscape, tearing into the bedrock to extract the rare earth minerals essential for the 21st century economy. Neodymium, terbium, and dysprosium, the lifeblood of everything from smartphones to fighter jets, were hauled out of the frozen ground in tonnages that shifted global markets overnight. What was once a pristine wilderness was rapidly becoming a sprawling industrial zone, a landscape of jagged gray craters and black exhaust plumes rising against the white horizon. But the minerals were only half the prize. Greenland was being surgically transformed into what Pentagon planners called the unsinkable aircraft carrier of the North. This was no longer just about Thule Air Base. It was about a total military saturation of the island. New deep-water ports were blasted into the ancient fjords to harbor American carrier strike groups, while the high, desolate plateaus were hollowed out to house vast networks of hypersonic missile silos. From these positions, the United States could strike any capital in the Northern Hemisphere in a matter of minutes. The island had become a fortress, a bristling sentinel of steel and sensors designed to project absolute power across the Arctic Circle. The cost of this security, however, was borne by those who had called this land home for generations. Under the clinical designation of strategic defense zones, entire Inuit communities were uprooted. Ancestral hunting grounds and sacred sites were fenced off with razor wire and patrolled by automated sentries. For the Greenlandic people, the promised path to prosperity had become a forced march. They were relocated to sterile, prefabricated housing units on the fringes of industrial hubs, separated from the sea and the ice that defined their existence. The new Commonwealth was proving to be a cold, metallic reality where local culture was secondary to the mission of extraction and defense. Greenland had been saved from foreign influence, but in the process, its soul was being paved over with reinforced concrete. This aggressive expansion, however, did not go unnoticed. Across the pole, a sleeping giant was waking up, and the American flag flying over Nuuk was about to trigger the most dangerous arms race in human history. The American flag snapping in the freezing winds of Nuuk didn't just signal a change in sovereignty, it sounded a clarion call in Moscow. For decades, the Kremlin had viewed the Arctic as its own backyard, a frozen fortress protecting its northern flank. Now, with U.S. hypersonic missiles stationed on Greenlandic soil, the distance between American firepower and the Russian heartland had shrunk to a terrifying margin. The response was immediate and massive. What began as a diplomatic protest quickly evolved into the most aggressive military buildup since the height of the Cold War. Russia declared a total Arctic defense zone, pouring billions into the restoration of mothballed Soviet-era outposts. From the Franz Josef Land Archipelago to the New Siberian Islands, the permafrost was hammered into runways for two 160 strategic bombers. Deep-sea submersibles began laying a dense web of acoustic sensors across the Lomonosov Ridge, claiming the very seabed as sovereign territory. The polar Cold War had arrived, and the Arctic Circle was being redrawn as the world's most dangerous iron curtain, one made not of concrete and wire, but of ice, sonar pings, and nuclear-tipped interceptors. This was no longer a regional dispute over fishing rights or mineral deposits. The top of the world had become a hair-trigger environment where the margin for error was non-existent. In the deep, dark waters of the Arctic Ocean, American and Russian attack submarines played a lethal game of cat and mouse beneath the ice caps, often coming within meters of a collision that could ignite a global conflagration. Above the ice, interceptor jets from both nations shadowed each other in the perpetual twilight of the polar winter, their pilots' fingers resting heavy on the triggers. The global community watched in helpless terror as the two superpowers turned the North Pole into a powder keg. A single stray signal, a misinterpreted sonar contact, or a navigational error by a lone pilot could now trigger a chain reaction leading to total nuclear exchange. The Greenland deal had promised security and prosperity, but it had instead delivered the world to the brink of an existential abyss. The Arctic, once a symbol of environmental fragility and international cooperation, was now the most heavily armed border on the planet, a frozen wasteland where the pulse of humanity's survival beat at the mercy of a single panicked command. This shift didn't just change the map, it shattered the very foundations of how nations interacted with one another. 10 years after the signing of the Nuuk Accords, the global landscape is unrecognizable. Historians and political scientists now point to the annexation of Greenland as the definitive moment the rules-based order died. The post-Cold War dream of international law, a world where the sovereignty of small nations was protected by collective agreements and shared values, has been replaced by a brutal neo-imperialist realism. The map of the Arctic has been redrawn in ink and iron, but the psychological map of the world has suffered even deeper scars. For decades, being a close ally of the United States was seen as the ultimate security guarantee. But for small nations from the South China Sea to the resource-rich plains of Africa, the Greenland precedent sent a chilling message. Your sovereignty is only as secure as your lack of strategic value. The world watched a founding member of NATO, a stable and democratic Western partner, have its territory carved away by its own protector. The lesson was clear. If you possess the rare earth minerals, the deep water ports, or the geographic positioning the superpower deems essential for its survival, your friendship with Washington is no longer a shield. It is a liability. The world learned a hard and bitter lesson in those 10 years. Borders are only as strong as the will to defend them. The United Nations has been reduced to a debating club with no teeth, its charter a relic of a more optimistic age. Diplomacy has devolved into a series of transactional ultimatums, where the might makes right philosophy of the 19th century has returned with 21st century precision. The annexation didn't just take an island, it shattered the trust that held the global community together. Every small state now looks at its larger neighbors not with the hope of cooperation, but with the cold calculation of survival, wondering when the next strategic necessity will put them in the crosshairs. The silence of the Arctic ice is now matched by a global silence, the sound of a world that has stopped believing in the power of words and started counting its missiles. The era of the great game has returned, and this time no one is safe. But as the cold winds of this alternate reality fade, we return to the world we actually inhabit. In our timeline, the 2019 proposal to purchase Greenland didn't spark a global catastrophe. It remained a diplomatic oddity, a momentary headline that was met with a firm no, and then largely forgotten. There were no carrier strike groups in the Davis Strait, no economic sieges of Copenhagen, and no betrayal of a century-old alliance. In the reality, we know the United States and the Kingdom of Denmark remain close, vital partners within NATO. The Arctic, while increasingly a focus of strategic competition, remains a zone characterized by international cooperation and established legal frameworks. The Arctic Council still functions, and the rules-based order while under pressure from various global shifts, still serves as the primary guardrail against the might makes right philosophy we just explored. It is a profound relief to realize that the Greenland crisis exists only in the realm of theory. We live in a world where sovereignty is still respected among allies, and where the complexity of international law provides a buffer against the raw exercise of power. We often take this stability for granted, forgetting that the peace we enjoy is built on a foundation of diplomatic norms that, if removed, could lead us down a very different, very dark path. In our reality, Greenland remains a land of breathtaking natural beauty and increasing self-governance, not a fortified industrial scar on the roof of the world. The Greenland precedent never happened, and the terrifying collapse of Western unity remains a fiction. For now, the lights in the Arctic are not those of massive industrial complexes or missile silos, but the quiet ancient glow of the aurora borealis over a peaceful frontier. Compare these two visions of our world. On one side, we see a dark timeline map, a Greenland scarred by massive open-pit mines, bristling with hypersonic missile silos, and surrounded by a fractured NATO. It is a world where the Arctic is a tattered front line and the rules-based order is a relic of a more optimistic past. On the other side, we see the map we actually inhabit, a vast white expanse of ice and rock governed by the Kingdom of Denmark and a Greenlandic people, serving as a scientific bridge between continents rather than a strategic battleground. It is easy to look at history as a series of inevitable collisions, but this thought experiment reminds us of a vital truth. History is often shaped not by what happens, but by the restraint of those in power. It is the deals not made, the invasions not launched, and the ultimatums never written that preserve the stability we so often take for granted. The Greenland crisis didn't happen because, in our reality, the bonds of alliance and the weight of international law still carry more value than a short-term land grab. In an era where strength is frequently equated with aggression, we must remember that the most complex and fragile structures we have ever built aren't aircraft carriers or industrial complexes. They are diplomatic norms. International law and the mutual respect for sovereignty are the only things standing between us and a return to a world where the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must. We should value the boring world of treaties and slow-moving diplomacy, for it is the only thing preventing the dark timeline from becoming a blueprint for our future. As we look toward the high north, let us be grateful for the silence. Let us appreciate a world where a proposal can be dismissed as a joke without triggering a war, and where the Arctic remains a frontier of wonder rather than a theater of dread. The sun sets over the Ilulissat Isfjord, casting long golden shadows across the ancient ice. There are no sirens here, no marching boots, no echoes of a broken alliance, just the wind, the cold, and a future that thankfully remains peaceful. This has been a look at the world that might have been, and a reminder to protect the world we have.